I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. Today we'll be talking about lesson 9 of our study, which covers selections from the book of the Prophet Baruch. Today we will be diving into the book of the Prophet Baruch. By way of setup, there are a few interesting things to look at. First, let's look at when the book itself tells us it was written, and then talk about why that's probably not entirely accurate, and why that's okay. So first part, we see here at the very beginning, when the book itself tells us it was written during the Babylonian exile. This is something that was presented in Babylon. So that's our setting and our context for what's being told in the book. And that'll be very important within the book. So the information, the context, what we're looking at is all rooted in that time period, and thereby historically follows the sequence we've been progressing down very well, and fits from a timing point of view with right where we want to be, which is why we're looking at this book here. So when was it written is a little harder. The book of Baruch is one of the Deuterocanonical books, which is to say, it's one of those pesky books that's in a Catholic Bible that's not in a Protestant Bible. We're not going to go into, the study itself goes into some of that detail, and a lot of information and research is available if you want to dig into those differences and why. For our purposes right now, it is sufficient to highlight that the Deuterocanonical books were written originally in Greek rather than Hebrew, which also likely dates them later, right? If you're in Babylon and you have recently come from Jerusalem, you are likely speaking some combination of Hebrew, Babylonian, or Aramaic, which is kind of a mashup of Hebrew and Babylonian, as I understand it, which I don't, so I could be wrong on that, but that's what I think is true there. But at any rate, those are the languages you would expect in a Babylonian kingdom among Hebrew people. Greek becomes relevant in the region only after Alexander of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great, conquers much of that Middle Eastern world and makes it part of the Kingdom of Macedon, and brings Greek as the predominant both language and culture to the region. We see in this book, not only is it originally written in Greek, so we've got the language side of that, it also references and looks at the concept of wisdom, which is a cultural influence from Greek thought as well. You know, the concept of philosophy, we say, originated with the Greeks, the philo part being love, the sophos part being the Greek word for wisdom. This idea of wisdom was a significant Greek value. And so this book is encountering the combination of those foreign values with the core Hebrew Jewish values, which is fine, right? In fact, that is some of what creates a distinct identity between Judaism as it's going to emerge leading into the time of Jesus and what existed before. It shapes and influences their religion, and it is not a bad thing that it does. And it, in many ways, paves the way intellectually for a lot of the underlying how we view things in Christianity as well. It's useful and important for developing our understanding of God. Philosophy encountering revelation helps to explain and to clarify revelation. It's a good thing. And we see some of that emerging here. But that would not have happened when this says that it's being written. It just wouldn't. So there is an extraordinarily high probability. We never want to say we can't know 100% 100% for sure, right? And we're directly contradicting what Revelation itself says, so I like to be a little cautious. But all of that said, there is so much evidence that this was written after Greek dominance of the region, which is much, much after the book itself claims to have been written, which again is fine. Which brings us to the last part of that, I guess. Is that okay? That there is a contradiction between when the book says it's being written and when it likely was. And yes, that's okay, right? As we're studying the Bible, it's really important to be able to distinguish between how we interpret things and what must be true and what needn't necessarily be true. The guarantee of truth within the scriptures is limited to what they reveal about God and not what they reveal about human history. They are not infallible historical records. No historical records are. They were still written by people as histories, and they are, or other forms of literature. And they are, as such, not guaranteed of historical accuracy. The human side of these things, like anything humans do, can be wrong or flawed. Or obviously the person who wrote this book knew that it wasn't being written when they said it was being written. That was not an uncommon literary device either, right? You're going to tell a story, you have themes and meaning you want to draw from a particular period of time, so you place your narrative of your book in that particular period of time. Doesn't mean that it was written then. But it's important to what you're trying to say and what you're trying to tell to orient your story then. Doesn't make it fake or false. Because again, you're telling true things about God. And that's the part that is guaranteed to be true. For some of us, that can be probably most of us at some point. As we get into Bible study, that's something we have to come to terms with, and it can be hard because we're taught that the Bible is true and can't be wrong, and we're not taught usually any kind of subtlety behind what that does and doesn't guarantee, and it can be shocking and it can challenge our faith a little bit if we don't, when we first see, oh, these things in the Bible aren't accurate. Does that challenge my whole faith? Well, no, it shouldn't. But anyway, that's what's going on and why it's okay. A lot more can be said and dug into on that, but the short version is Bible is guaranteed to be true about God, not guaranteed to be true about history. For the sake of interpretation here in this lesson, we are going to treat this very much like it was written after it claims to have been, which is going to allow us to develop the theme of the clash between Israelite and Hellenist cultures and ideas, and the merging and marrying of those ideas and themes as well, which is very important in the book of Baruch, as we'll see, as this idea of wisdom emerges as a significant theme, as it does in most of the Deuterocanonical literature. In fact, there is a book called Wisdom in that body of literature. It becomes a very important idea, but it comes from Greek influence that it comes to be an important idea. So, Baruch is primarily where we'll address and touch on that in this study, as it's a study of the prophets, and this is mostly where we'll encounter that in the prophets. It is otherwise predominantly in the wisdom literature. But we will also visit, fascinatingly, some other Deuterocanonical works that are much more historical. At least one of them is in the first book of Maccabees. And those works help us bridge the historical gap from the return up through to the time of Jesus. And those are, again, much more historical. They don't purport to have been written earlier. They are written later, and they just help us fill in some of that history, especially the history of Greek and later Roman influence coming into this region, which we really have to understand to get from the return to the coming of Jesus. So that's not this study or this lesson. We are going to get to that. It is fascinating. For now, this is Greek-inspired or influenced Israelite religion, on its way to becoming Judaism. It's fascinating. It is also, it's using that cultural influence to try to talk about and describe the Babylonian cultural influence on this as well, which also happened. It's just a fascinating way of doing it, and it's really cool. So we're going to get into that a little bit here in this introduction. Again, we've got this being proclaimed, this book of Baruch, in an audience. It is in exile to the remnant that is in exile, knowing that there is stuff still going on at home that they wouldn't be overwhelmingly thrilled with. We're seeing, and we've talked about, in fact, the people who go into exile in many ways fare better than the ones who don't. And it's the core of the religious tradition is better preserved in exile than it is among those who don't go into exile, and is solidified so that they come back with their return and they bring a new and more devoted form of religious practice than the people who stayed behind managed to have. And this is kind of the emergence of that. So that's where we're going. This seems a little weird. So what's happening? The people in exile are sending money and our instruments of worship back to Jerusalem. That kind of seems like the opposite of what you would think would happen, right? You would think, oh, a bunch of your faithful people are in exile. You in Jerusalem are going to try to do what you can to support their faith. But again, it goes the other way. This is strongly setting up that in exile, Jerusalem is not the core, the center of the faith. But it is still the religious center, right? They still see what's happening in Jerusalem as critical and important. So it's hard to overstate the importance of this divide. For hundreds of years in the history of this people, Jerusalem has been the only center of the religion, right? It is this necessary, the holy city, the location where God has specified that things happen, and it has been the center of worship and thought in terms of, the high priest lived there, the religious leaders lived there, so it was the center of kind of authority as well as the center of kind of the presence of God. And so it all kind of got lumped together. Here we're seeing a significant divide, right? Jerusalem is still and remains for the duration of the Old Covenant, the place that is God's house on earth, right? With or without a really fancy temple, it is, God has bound himself to, in his relationship to these people, also to this city. And it is in their rules and their law that Jerusalem is the holy city, and that certain worship is linked and tied in their law to Jerusalem as a physical place. And so the place has tremendous importance to them. There's no escaping that. That is a large part among the faithful of why they hate being in exile. It's not so much even that they're away from home. It's that they're away from their holy site, and there are things in their religious practice that they cannot do without Jerusalem. There are feasts that cannot be had. Sacrifices don't work the same way, right? Before, when they were traveling in the desert and they had a tabernacle, God could travel around with them. And with that, they could sacrifice where they were going because that's where God was, right? But you take away God, the sacrifices aren't a meaningful thing, right? The priesthood is linked to wherever the presence of God is. And the whole liturgy surrounding offering and sacrifice is likewise, they didn't have the same idea that we do, that you have churches all over the place and you can liturgically participate with God wherever you want to. Even we still can't, right? You don't do liturgy in your home. You still have to go to a church. It's just that we don't have to have it's not just St. Peter's or St. John's in Rome is the only place where we can offer the Mass. But that is functionally how things worked for them. And so when you are separated from Jerusalem, there's a whole category of their liturgy, which is most of it, that they can't do. But there is another side to their religion that develops in exile. And this is where we got to talking about what happens to their religious practice in exile. In the absence of functional priesthood with things to do, instead you start focusing more on, as we'll see progressing through this book, the things that God told you to be doing, and the law. And so in the absence of the ability to participate in that liturgy, the law emerges as an increasingly important idea, because that's what you can do in exile. And they can have a religious center in exile that is focused on and devoted to this idea of following and observing the law. And so you have a new center of religious teaching and authority in exile, not bound to Jerusalem. And what this ultimately does is it allows the spread of Judaism in a way it couldn't before. When they began to spread and expand, they didn't build temples everywhere. They built synagogues, which is a different building. It's not a place set up for animal sacrifice. It's a place set up for teaching and study. And that became as important or more important to the core of these people than animal sacrifice and the liturgical functions that went with that. Cleanliness and purity became kind of the intersecting point between the two, which is where cleanliness law and a lot of that becomes so key, and we see it at the time of Jesus. There's still a lot of overlap and marriage between these two views, but you have priests whose function is still liturgical and centered in Jerusalem, and then you have scribes or scholars of the law who have the ability to function with religious authority whether or not they are in Jerusalem. In exile, the scribes are going to be in charge of the community, and you see religious practices thriving, right? They are, in fact, the image here is one of them wanting to support and uphold Jerusalem, but them kind of being the center now, right? And so we're setting up, there's going to be conflict. We're setting up conflict on the return between ideologies and, to some extent, different groups of people as well. So you've got priests and you've got scribes. Some people are both, some people are not. And you've got the ideology that focuses on the religious practices and sacrifices, and you've got an ideology that focuses on the law. And again, there's a lot of overlap, and some people are very comfortable with both, and some of them are not, which will ultimately manifest in partisan differences, which we see in the time of Jesus in the form of having Sadducees and Pharisees. Sadducees being from the line of these priests whose authority is rooted in the location and the sacrifices, and Pharisees being rooted in the line of these scribes, whose authority comes from the law. We'll talk about that more. We've got a long way to go. We're not fully developed along those lines yet, but this is where that begins. So it's worth pausing a moment to call out and to say something interesting is happening here. Additional point, we should talk just briefly here about Baruch. and where he fits into that. Baruch is kind of the perfect representation of this split. Baruch and Ezra, which we'll get to Ezra. But Baruch is in the line of priests, which, how do you become a priest, by the way? You probably all remember it is a hereditary thing, right? It is a birthright. You can't become a priest if you weren't born to become a priest. You can become a scribe if you weren't born to become a scribe. A scribe is like a job that you can choose to do. A priesthood is a birthright that you have and is like a family business that you can't just join into if you weren't born into it. Baruch is both. Baruch was born into the priesthood and chose to become also a scribe. And so we see initially these two things of the priesthood and this legal tradition are merged in the beginning, right? Which makes sense, right? You go into exile, the religious leaders you had before you went into exile are the same ones you have, or after you're in exile, are the same ones you had before you went into exile. But as things grow and adapt over time, you see that doesn't stay as true. But Baruch, at any rate, is both. And so he serves and is also, the book tells us, speaking with the authority also of the prophet Jeremiah. So he's being pitched as priest and scribe, kind of empowered by the prophet Jeremiah. And so he has this tremendous amount of authority as priest, scribe, and on behalf of a prophet. So he's someone who can be authoritatively the figure that is sort of representing this change, right? When we see a change like this, it is a big deal. But again, we don't think that this was actually written in the time that it's claiming to have been, so it also is not actually written by Baruch or from words of Jeremiah in all likelihood. Again, we're orienting it that way because it is significant to the tradition and the ideas that we're trying to get across. Just as 2nd Isaiah was not written by Isaiah, but is in that line and contains the heritage and the viewpoints and the perspective that helps shape how we look at it. It's related, and that's how we're meant to look at it. We're also meant to look at this book and what it's conveying through that lens of priest, scribe, and prophet. And that's the framing of this being the book of Baruch. This is the other major ideological shift we see in this book. Less so about religious practice, but important to it. The resources they're sending back are for what unusual purpose? Are to make offerings and prayers and supplications on behalf of a foreign king. Probably immediately in exile, that is not a thing we would have done. By the time we are used to being ruled by Babylonians, Macedonians, Seleucids, and Romans, that is the thing we would have become much more comfortable with. Again, the identity of these people in the return and the way they exist, let's say geopolitically, is different from before they went into exile. Going into exile, they were a sovereign nation. That will never be true again. At least for all intents and purposes, that will never be true again. And so they get used to existing and thriving at the goodwill of whoever is their ruler. So we see that the people in exile, the people not in exile, again, maybe haven't adjusted to that idea yet and are still trying to be sovereign. The people in exile, on the other hand, are saying, you know, these Babylonians really aren't that bad. Like, we may be in exile, but we have stuff, right? They have money they can send back. It's not like they're slaves like they were in Egypt. They're clearly not being horribly mistreated in exile. They're allowed to practice their religion. They're allowed to accumulate property. It's not so bad, and they're realizing that. And in fact, they're realizing, there are some benefits to this that we didn't face before. If we're aligned with the right sovereign, we don't have to worry so much about what all of our neighbors are doing. Because if they get out of line, somebody else will come in and fix that. So at some point, these people become very comfortable with the idea of being ruled. And from a religious point of view, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you want to focus on the worship of God, you don't really necessarily want to have to worry about murdering all your neighbors all the time. The two are kind of in conflict. The two are in conflict. At least and we've talked about this a lot, it's a fascinating theme. We see emerging this theme of nonviolence as being superior to violence. And that is kind of the next step that these people are taking. Their kingdom, with their sovereignty, was necessarily kind of brutally violent a lot. That's one of the criticisms you see of the Old Testament, is how can God love us, and how can a loving, caring God be at the center of all of this brutality that you see in the Old Testament? Well, we're not doing that anymore, right? It turns out that this is a strange thing to think about. The original vision was God would rule the people. They abandoned that. They get closer to the promise of what that meant when Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and some of these other people rule them than they ever did when they ruled themselves. Because a sovereign nation is not what God intended to found. It was not the vision, right? He intended to found a people, yes. A nation, not so much. There's a version of that he rolls with. And he ultimately intends a king. But he did not seem to have intended that in the same way that anybody ends up thinking if they try to include politics in it, right? Like even our church made that mistake after the fact and spent a lot of years heavily involved in politics and the rule of kingdoms, and has come to the same conclusion that the Jews ultimately landed on, which is that is maybe not compatible with the worship of God, and it's likely best to stay out of that if we want to be serving God. So God's kingdom, yes. Kingdom, no, not in the sense that humans think of it and tend to do it. So this is a big shift in, again, right, you get the benefit of fast forwarding ideologically several hundred years and looking back and now saying, oh yeah, these people were totally cool with the king that was over them in exile. Maybe not when exile was still pretty fresh, but it helps us see where they're going, right? We know that they end being pretty okay being ruled, and looking back, the author is placing that thought on the people in exile, whether it was there yet with Nebuchadnezzar or not. It's likely from an historical point of view that until they're allowed to return, they have much less of a friendly and positive attitude toward the king overseeing their exile. If it were for Cyrus, I could see it a lot more than Nebuchadnezzar. But anyway, it's fascinating in that it shows the attitude that the people later adopt, which is pro-foreign rule. Which, leading into the time of Jesus, is also fascinating because that soured a little bit toward the Romans, right? There's a whole contingent that thinks, we don't need foreign kings, and we don't like this arrangement after all, even though they're pretty much letting us do whatever we want regarding our religious practice. Wouldn't it be great if we went back to having a sovereign kingdom? The people wishing that, within this context, we can see are egregiously missing the point. They're thinking, oh, the kingdom of David is the pinnacle and the high point of our society, our culture, our potential. But the narrative here that the prophets are telling us is that that was not a high point at all, right? That was a deviation from what God wanted the people to be doing. It was a detour that led to a dead end. And so we had to go back and redo things from Passover and take a different road that doesn't lead to a dead end. And so at the time of Jesus, having this contingent that says, no, we want to go back down that dead end, well, your progression as a people stops there. You are on the path that leads to the Messiah that's not David, that can keep you going forward. And you want your Messiah to just be David again, and to do war on your enemies again, and to do all these things that didn't work. And you're not going to do it better this time if you go down that road. It's a fascinating thing. The prophets have set up, we have moved beyond that. And then some of the Jewish leaders, I think because they're looking at political power over service of God, like the idea of, again, being a sovereign nation. And I think it's more about the personal selfish interests of those in charge than it is about any sense of service of God or where he wants his people to go. Which is why they don't recognize who Jesus is and what he's doing, right? Is because they don't want what he's doing. They want what they want. And so they murder God himself because they prefer that violent, power-hungry, that deviation, right? They prefer the human-driven version of what service of God looks like. And we've seen that that is only capable of spectacular failure. And in fact, the rest of this book is going to kind of show us that, hey, let's rethink a little bit, and oh, whoops, yeah, let's try again. And let's maybe do some things differently. And that's where the legal focus that we're going to put on top of the liturgical focus of this religion that comes to be merged together into Judaism, it takes us down a different road because it's way more concerned with how we're behaving. And that matters. Anyway, that's kind of direction we're going, but it's worth, when we're talking about this, it's very worth just thinking a little bit about the absurdity of the Jewish leaders at the time of Jesus and how what they want shows that they have misunderstood their own history and tradition and have not seen in it correctly where God is trying to go. Now, it's easy for me to sit here and say that because hindsight is 20/20. And I can see thousands of years of where God has gone that they couldn't. So, not trying to say I'd be on the right side of that if I were there in history either. But now looking back, we can see their mistake. And that is also kind of useful for us in the world today. The same sort of deal applies, right? God is not really interested in politics or clashes with those who are ruling so much as with allowing us to exist and to practice free from that interference. And we can see over-involvement in power and politics generally tends to be distasteful to and opposed to those trying to serve God. Of course, all of this happened prior to democratic systems of government as well that allowed semi-equal representation for a lot of people and kind of adds a whole other level of obligation for some degree of political participation among Christians, etc. It gets complicated, right? I'm not trying to say don't be political at all, because that's also not accurate. It's more complicated in the world today, and we're not going to totally go there. It is to say, though, there are lessons about desiring power and authority and how that fits or doesn't with worship of God that I think do carry over to and inform how we behave in the world today. We see all of this builds. This is, as we were setting up, this is sort of that idea of let's take a step back from where we've been, right? We are here in exile, still enjoying the righteous fruit of our unrighteous behavior. God is punishing us. They have evolved in thought to the point that here they're saying, and we deserve it. Not we deserved it. God, we've had enough. Please let this pass. But we deserve it. And we're fine here because our minds and our hearts have not yet changed. And so we still deserve where we are. Not because of what we did before, but because of where we are now. We still have not repented and reformed. We're still not following God's ordinances, God's laws, the way we need to be. So we're still in exile because we're still not deserving of not being in exile. What becomes the central idea here, again, the practice of and the observance of the law becomes the guiding light. God, you told us this was going to happen through your prophets. It did. Our bad. We deserve it. Let us step back. Let us return. It is like it's compared to the period in Egypt. Only this time it's deserved, right? The fascinating contrast is there's no sin of the people that caused them to be enslaved in Egypt. That was the wrongdoing of the Egyptians and not of the Israelites. The return back to that state is not a fault of the Babylonians. We're not saying these are wicked, terrible Babylonians that need to be crushed by myriad plagues and have their firstborn killed by God, because it's not their fault that they did this to us. It's ours. And so if there's any plague, if there's any punishment, it should come on us, the Israelites, and not on our captors. And it is. Our captors are that plague for us. And until we have repented, it should continue. What a fascinating thought. And again, one easier to put in people's minds 200 years in the future. It's more clearly developed, or however many, I don't actually know the timeline, however many years in the future. It is easier to, again, hindsight, put that viewpoint back on the people, but it's an extremely valid viewpoint, right? And this is a fascinating idea of we need to go back, we need to start over. The road we have been going down has been going in the wrong direction. So we need to go back, we need to learn to observe the law and pay much more attention to that. We need to be less interested in building a kingdom and more interested in following and observing God's law. And everything else will take care of itself. And so, yes, we are currently ruled, but again, when we do our part right, the rest of it will be fine. And we don't have to worry about, in fact, we kind of like these Babylonians, all things considered, way better than the Egyptians were. So our focus in exile should not be on going home. Because again, that's in the category of things that will take care of themselves. Our focus should be on loving and serving God and following His laws. And there's a massive lesson for all of us today in that. This is a hard reality of trying to serve God, is not worrying about our circumstances, which are outside of our control, and instead letting our worry, our focus, our attention be on the things that are in our control, which is our behavior. You can't always control what happens to you, and there will be periods in time in all of our lives where our circumstances are not fun. And there will be nothing we can do about it. Welcome to being human. But in the midst of all of that, there are things that we have control over. And that is, are we still, to the very best of our ability, loving and serving God? And if we are, then He'll take care of the rest. Might not be the way we'd like to do it, but again, the history of these people at this point in time is when we're steering the ship, it goes badly off course. And maybe that's not the best idea. And maybe if we let God steer, even though we don't necessarily love the neighborhood we might be driving through at the moment, it's taking us by the fastest and most direct route to the best place that we can be. We just have to sort of trust and take our hands off the wheel and let God point us in the right direction. And that's where we get when we focus on doing our part that we do control correctly. Fascinating lesson. Very interesting thing to see developing here among these people. Just a tremendous insight into this exile and what makes it different from the period in Egypt. Building further on the theme, another fascinating development here. It's easier to see in hindsight. The appeal here is to Moses. Let's talk a little bit as we unpack this difference between scribes and priests about Moses and Aaron and the relationship between the two. First, obvious question, but I'm going to ask it. You all know the answer. Who is more important, Moses or Aaron? Obviously Moses, right? Who is the first priest? Aaron, right? Not Moses. What did Moses give the people other than appointing his brother as a priest? He's most known and referenced here for giving the people the law. That's an interesting dynamic because it's so easy as we're coming through the history of these people to set up the idea of the priesthood and this practice that stems from it as being the key and the most important thing. But we have from its foundation the idea that the law and the lawgiver are above the priesthood and rooted more directly in God's authority. And that becomes an increasingly important idea for scribes for obvious reasons. And so the appeal here is back to Moses. Moses, who gave us the law, told us that all of this was going to happen. That, if you transgress the law, you're going to find yourself no longer in possession of the promised land. And you shouldn't worry about that, because when you figure it out and you follow the law again, you'll get the promised land back, because God's promise is eternal. But we see again that shift, that ideological shift, saying we got it wrong when we made the priesthood the important thing. And the focus became around the acts and practices of the priesthood. Again, it was people who liked the idea of being important and having power. It wasn't always that way, but even early on, if you've been following us to this point through from the United Kingdom forward, you have seen the failure of the priesthood as they liked being important and having positions of authority. And they enjoyed their power more than they enjoyed teaching people to follow God's commandments, ordinances. Right? Even back then, it was a failure to observe the law rather than a failure to observe sacrificial and ritual practices that was the problem. This is not a new idea emerging. It's a re-emphasis of an old core idea, but it's kind of like the people in exile are discovering what God intended all along and are saying, oh, we weren't doing that. Whoops. And are saying right here, Moses told us from the beginning that this was a possibility if we didn't get it, and told us the thing that has happened was the thing that would happen, and also told us the solution. Oh, all you have to do when that happens is fix your behavior and it'll be fine. So that's where we are, and again, important for looking toward how the difference between Judaism and Israelite religious practice before is Judaism has that renewed emphasis on correctly placing that hierarchy with the law over and above the priesthood. An idea that continues through the time of Jesus, but we'll talk about that more when we get into the New Testament, as this study does. I don't want to anticipate everything too much. We want to keep it fun when we get there too, and interesting. So for now, that re-examining and rethinking or rediscovering of kind of what God intended is going to be one of the key things that helps shape how these people think and behave moving forward. Here we begin to see that ideological and cultural intermingling that we set up. That again is fascinating. What is the Old Covenant? If you've been participating in our studies, or the Covenant, not just the Old Covenant. If you've been participating in our studies, one would hope that you know, but can't blame you if you don't. It can be summarized kind of as this single core idea for those who are new or wanting a reminder that if you sin, you die. And the corollary that is important in the New Testament, if you don't sin, you don't die. That is the basic, so the rules of the covenant are rules that govern life and death. That is an ancient and foundational idea to these people, right? The whole of the liturgical practice that we talked about around the sacrifice of animals, etc. If you go through the book of Leviticus and beyond, that's all around life and death, right? It's no accident that you atone for your sins that merit your death by giving a life, right? The ideas of life and death are deeply interrelated, and that liturgical practice is based around how do we deal with violation of the covenant, right? Again, it serves as secondary to the law. The law is primary. If you don't sin, you don't need any of that liturgy, right? If you never commit a sin and never incur God's punishment, that is all superfluous to you. Which is why we don't practice those same things, because our pathway to atonement comes through Jesus Christ, who didn't sin and didn't need any of that. And so it comes through different forms. The new covenant doesn't supersede the old. It's just that all of our means of atoning for sin come through Jesus Christ, and he himself didn't need those liturgical practices in the same way because he didn't sin. New Testament study, Book of Hebrews, there's a ton of stuff to look at outside the scope of this study related to the development of the priesthood and liturgical practice. That's outside of the scope a little bit, right? But it is worth noting here, again, the idea from the point of view of the covenant, the law, the rules are still the important part, and the liturgical practice is still secondary. That's not a thing that Judaism made up. It's a thing that was always there that they figured out finally and started doing better. So that's significant. But here we are taking those key ideas of life and death and the law, and we're adding something. We're adding the idea of wisdom as being a key and critical connected point to that. Hear the commandments of life, O Israel. Give ear and learn wisdom. This idea of wisdom is being tacked on and connected with the idea of the commandments and the law. And so we're taking, again, this kind of Greek thought, and we're elevating it and putting it alongside this idea of the law that we are newly elevating to be the most important thing. And so we're intermingling here at the root of our practice the importance of wisdom and the study of wisdom and the law. It is a positive intermingling. But it is an outside influence. And it's potentially an idea that helped to fit all the pieces together and to elevate the law, right? It's possible that people more concerned with study and the acquisition of wisdom and the exposure of God's people to that helped them realize, oh yeah, actually God revealed a tremendous amount to us, and figuring out what that is would probably be a good idea. And let's try to understand that better. And God, through his revelation, actually has helped us obtain wisdom, if only, we had bothered to look at it. So it becomes very interesting, and that's where we see wisdom entering. We'll talk a little bit more about it. We also get the idea of Hades tacked on in the conversation of death. Again, Greek thought, not worth dwelling on too much for all practical purposes. Let's say it's the same as death here. It sort of is, and it's close enough. It's just another Greek idea entering the thought, and more evidence that this is intermingling of cultures and thoughts. Building gracefully on the theme, there's an emphasis here that's also important, but it's probably pretty obvious at this point if you've been joining along with us, which is possessing wisdom and observing the law are being looked at as kind of the same idea, which, may or may not be accurate, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And it shows us where people are thinking, right? It shows us that idea of that merging again of cultures and viewpoints. Pursuit of wisdom was very much a high Greek ideal, and it's being joined to observing the law, a high Jewish ideal, to create kind of a unified viewpoint and worldview. It's worth, for all of us, thinking about, is that true? There is certainly trying to go down that road and practice that way certainly won't lead us badly astray, right? Trying to become increasingly wise won't lead us generally to behave worse, I would say. I would also propose, however, that in the Christian tradition, a separate virtue has come to be, if you want to grow the most in following God. I would say there's a different virtue that stands, although it's almost contradictory to say this, that stands head and shoulders above all of the other ones, and what it is. Think about it if you want. You can pause the video if you want to think about it for a little while. I am not holy enough myself to be able to vouch for this, but the saints have almost universally placed humility as the key virtue and the thing toward which we should most be aspiring if we would progress in holiness. It's an interesting thing. Again, some of it's cultural, some of it has to do with differences between Christianity and Judaism, right? If we're serving and worshiping a God who became one of us and modeled, they didn't have Jesus yet, right? They had a law, and the understanding of that law being the highest religious attainment, yes, that takes wisdom. It makes perfect sense to be marrying those two concepts where they're at in history. But for us, the understanding of the right way to practice our faith is just be like Jesus. And Jesus is almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing God who became a person like the rest of us, who lowered himself in that way in order to serve us. And so for us, doing that is going to be much faster than trying to obtain wisdom. We don't even have to understand why or how all of that works, right? There's a lot that we can benefit from continuing to understand, but you can be very holy without understanding how any of it works, right? You don't have to know how it is that Jesus obtained your salvation to be saved and to be holy. Humility is a much faster road for us than wisdom is. And that road has been, again, incredibly shortened by Jesus. If we just take our hands off the wheel, let him say, go that way, and we go that way. Instead of saying, what's over there? Why should I go over there? I need to understand, isn't this way faster? Right? A lot of that was important before Jesus, before revelation was completed or perfected in a new living Word of God. There was a lot to try to puzzle out. Now we just are left to do and to imitate. That's why there's a difference that's probably worth commenting on, but in this context, it makes perfect sense to join or to uphold wisdom in the way it's being upheld as kind of a chief virtue, and it explains much about the importance of the study and understanding of the law being sort of linked to the following of the law. Of course, we see it's also very possible to start to try to understand the law pretty well and not do it very well at all, which Jewish leaders at Jesus' time demonstrate. But he also kind of indicates pretty strongly that they don't actually understand the law very well. And there are those who potentially at the time of Jesus did understand it much better, and they were choosing to live out in the desert away from Jerusalem because they saw that as a distraction and something that made it harder to practice and follow the law, and they wanted to do that. So lots of interesting things going on. Again, we will go through the time of Jesus in the study. We've got some history to figure out before we get there. Wisdom and the practice of the law. So this passage takes us just one step farther and says not only, wisdom and practice of the law, but is also suggesting wisdom and God, right? God is the only one who really has wisdom. Seems to be the suggestion here. But there's also a probably not accidental bit of foreshadowing that is pretty interesting. Who has gone up into heaven and taken her and brought her down from the clouds? Well, God did that too, right? As we were just talking about, this anticipates where this goes. Is only God, as it turns out, is wise and has wisdom. And so it's not for us to gain wisdom. Ultimately, we can't, which is such a fascinating contradiction. It's right here. Wisdom is the most important thing, but you can't get it. Only God has it. And you only get it if he brings it to you, which he's going to do. But it's so interesting that it's in the text there, because I don't think that's the point the author is trying to make at all. But it is the point the author does make. And it just comes out as leading to exactly what we were just talking about. For us, ultimately, pursuit of wisdom is not the way to holiness. God brought it to us, but we don't have to be wise to access it because he just tells us what to do. And we don't have to figure it out, which is where wisdom comes in. We can just obey. Building on a point, it is so fascinating how Revelation works. And this is where we get to, whether this is literally descriptive of history or not, this is true even in a way it may not have meant to be in terms of what it's saying about God. There we have it. At this point, the theme has been pretty well established. We're bringing it home a little bit. Again, wisdom equal to the law or the commandments, which are kind of the law. And a reminder that, you're in your bad spot here because you didn't follow God, and if you followed the law, which of course wisdom would allow you to do, then you wouldn't be in the position that you're in. It's kind of, again, restating, but it's interjecting this idea of wisdom into that earlier narrative that we looked at without it, right? We're just sort of reshaping and redefining and fitting in this other idea into the existing tradition, which again, not a bad thing, very interesting thing. And there we are. Here we end, as probably any good book of prophecy ought to, with hope and a promise of better things to come. You'll come back to God, He'll show mercy, and you will find joy. One note, because I think it's really interesting, and we're in a good context and place to explain it. What's the difference between joy and happiness? This applies especially to people in exile. So human beings are very much dynamic, adaptable. There's this idea of homeostasis, right? That things kind of tend to normalize. For example, if I drink a lot of coffee and caffeine, my body gets used to having it there, and so relies on it a little bit. So instead of having the initial kick every time I drink a cup of coffee, it instead helps get me more toward normal, and I start to feel abnormal without it, because my body is adapted to the idea of having that there, right? It is a thing that happens biologically, it's a thing that happens psychologically as well, right? We adapt to the situation that we're in and it becomes normal. And happiness is only defined as relative to that normal, right? If I end up not having, for example, very much money and having financial stress all the time, that becomes my normal. And getting more money temporarily is a state that is better than my normal. And so that better deviation from normal is happiness, right? That is the thing that makes me happy. Whereas a worse deviation from my normal is the thing that makes me very unhappy. But if I always have a comfortable to live amount of money, that becomes for me my normal. And so getting more money may not necessarily make me terribly happier, right? There might be other things, good things that I want that could make me so. Or, being in a romantic relationship or a marriage could be a thing that I don't have, so I think that would make me happy. But I get to it, I have it, it becomes the new normal, and it just sort of is now, right? Happiness is always defined relative to the current state and requires something in addition to the current state, which is why it's such a fickle thing to pursue, because it always will require more. Joy is not that way, because it's not rooted in, it doesn't originate from us. As we talk about it, at least within a Christian context, joy is something that is infused into us by God. It is very much a spiritual and not a material or a natural thing. It comes to us from the divine, outside of our own power. And as such, it's not a thing that we get used to or adapt to, right? Joy as a divinely infused thing is something we can experience constantly and never adapt to. That's the promise here. It's not, hey, you all be happy, because God cannot make us forever happy, because I guess He could, but it always requires more, and that's not really what God is seeking. He's infinite, He could do it that way, but that's not what He's seeking to do for us. He's seeking to provide for us outside of that human state of happiness or unhappiness, which is why we also instead talk about the concept of joy. And that's the promise here. And it's worth keeping in mind. God is not, because of the difference, that's not about you'll have all the money you need, or you'll find the partner that you think you want, or whatever it is you think will make you happy. That's not what God is promising to do for everyone, because ultimately that still doesn't satisfy. What God is promising is something else. So if we seek to serve God to find happiness, we're going to be disappointed in all likelihood. But if you instead seek God to find joy, you'll probably find what you're seeking. And that we get by seeking wisdom, following the law, all the things outlined in this book. So in summary, exile, not really that bad. Consequence of your own actions. Whenever you manage to figure out what you're doing, it can end. And ultimately, God has a plan to bring you back and to satisfy your wants and needs and to give you joy. This has been an overview of Lesson 9 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.